This year marks the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. The occasion provides humanity with the opportunity to reflect on the sacrifices made and also to learn from the past. Yet Africa's role in the war remains one of the least told stories. Over 1 million Africans were conscripted to fight in a war they knew nothing about. Some 100,000 of them never returned home. So this week on the program, we ask, what is the legacy of the Second World War in Africa? And did the world learn from its mistakes to prevent another global war? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. An estimated 70 to 85 million people died during the Second World War. Many of them died fighting far from home. Well, we begin our show today at the Nairobi War Cemetery, where some of the fallen soldiers have been laid to rest. Well, joining me to tell me more about the Nairobi War Cemetery is Daniel Achini. He's the Regional Manager, East Africa at the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Daniel, tell us about this war cemetery.
Thank you very much for having me. Now, this cemetery is the largest war cemetery we have in East Africa. It's also a biodiverse habitat. As you can see, there are many plants, diverse species of plants, and also we have a bit of wildlife here. This cemetery is also one of the most beautiful green spaces we have in Nairobi. The cemetery was started in 1941 by the military authorities. And apart from the original burials that were brought in here, we had other burials that came from the African civil cemeteries across Kenya and also from the temporary military burial grounds. And we also have memorials, the East African Memorial and the Nairobi War Memorial, inside this space.
So what is the significance of this particular war cemetery?
Now, the cemetery is significant because this is where we commemorate casualties who died during the Second World War. Now, in the Nairobi War Cemetery, we have 1,942 casualties of the Second World War commemorated here. And these casualties were drawn from different countries of the Commonwealth. And that diversity of the casualties commemorated here shows the true global nature of the World War II conflict. We have casualties from Kenya, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Nigeria, Somalia. We also have casualties from South Africa, New Zealand, Canadians, and also Australians commemorated in this cemetery. In addition to that, we have the East African Memorial within this cemetery, and that memorial commemorates men and women of the land forces who died in the conflicts in Ethiopia, Italian Somaliland, and also Madagascar. As we commemorate VJ today, that memorial, the East African Memorial, is quite significant because close to 1,300 casualties commemorated in that memorial are those men and women who fell when their ship was sunk off the Indian Ocean by a Japanese submarine.
So, Daniel, what were the origins of this war cemetery?
Just a background, Nairobi during the Second World War was the headquarters of the East African Force. It was also an important base for the conquest of Jubaland and the Italian Somaliland. Nairobi also served as a critical base for the liberation of British Somaliland and also the sweep northwestwards to open up Addis Ababa for the return of the emperor. Now, in addition, Nairobi served as a hospital base during the Second World War. There were two hospitals here. Hospital number 87, British General Hospital, that was here between June 1943 to December 1945. And there was another hospital, hospital number 150, British General Hospital again, for a period in 1943. This cemetery was opened up in 1941, as I've mentioned, as a military cemetery by the military authorities then, and several other burials were brought in from the African civil cemeteries across Kenya and also temporary army burial grounds in Kenya.
So where was the war concentrated in Africa?
Of course, the war was quite widespread in Africa, but specifically in East Africa, we had fighting in the northeastern part of Kenya towards the border with Ethiopia because of the conflict in that region. We had a conflict also towards the border with Somalia and actually inside Somalia, fighting in the Italian Somaliland, and there was also fighting in Madagascar. And some of those casualties are commemorated in this cemetery.
And are there other war cemeteries around the world? Where are they scattered?
Yes, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission maintains cemeteries and memorials in over 150 countries and territories across the globe, and we maintain around 23,000 locations like this across the world, commemorating casualties who fell in both the First and the Second World War. And currently in total we have around 1.7 million men and women who died in the two conflicts commemorated in our sites.
Mm-hmm. So why is it important to commemorate? What is now the significance of the commemoration?
It's very important to keep the memories of these casualties alive. And actually, as we look at the VJ Day, this does not just mark the end of the Second World War. It's more of commemorating the sacrifices of the men and women who died during the Second World War. And it's important. And as an organization, we keep these cemeteries to keep those memories alive, because these casualties sacrificed their lives for our freedom today. And we need to keep these stories for generations to come. And our focus actually is now going into more of digital preservation of stories, and we are talking to family members of the casualties who died, and even the veterans who came back after the Second World War, to try and document their experiences for future generations. Now in Kenya, we have this Nairobi War Cemetery here and 37 other sites in the country, because Kenyans gave their own people to serve in the war, and it's important we connect with others who served in the war and connecting their histories and stories. And they're very important for us as Kenyans to actually maintain and keep them.
And what about for the families? Has there been closure? Does this provide some sort of closure for the families of the soldiers?
Yes, indeed. And as I mentioned, we maintain these cemeteries to make sure that these casualties are remembered. Not only by their families, but also for the public. And we have so many family members who come to this cemetery, for example, to pay their respects to their loved ones. And we have other families out there who are still doing research to know where their loved ones died. And that's why, as an organization, we keep a rich record of the casualties that we commemorate across the globe, and the public can interact with our records. Just get the names, get to know where they died, where they are buried, and pay their respects. So yes, we are getting closer, and people are still, doing more to get more information about their loved ones.
All right, Daniel, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, we're going to take a short break now, and when we come back, we will be joined by a panel of experts to take up this discussion on the impact of the Second World War on Africa. To stay with us. And joining me now to unpack the impact of the Second World War on Africa are, from Lagos, Christopher Ogunmodede, policy analyst and international relations expert. And with me here in studio in Nairobi, Dr. Kenneth Ombogi, Associate Dean of Research and Postgraduate Studies at the University of Nairobi. Gentlemen, welcome to the program, and thank you very much for joining us. Dr. Ombogi, let me start off with you here. World War II was one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. It had devastating consequences both for civilians and the combatants. What were the most significant contributions of African soldiers and territories to the Allied war?
Thank you, Beatrice. Now, you see, the greatest impact of the Second World War on the people of Africa was really that they were part and parcel of this war that was not part of what one could call an African experience. And many of them paid their ultimate price that anyone could pay in war, which is to die in the war front. Many of them were affected by disease and many other things. But the more lasting impact that the war had, particularly in Africa, is actually disruption of families and the social setup. Men were forced, conscripted, left their villages, left families to go to faraway lands, to fight for a cause that they knew very little about, to fight for the British Empire. And the irony of that is that they were fighting for an empire that had oppressed them for very long. And it continued to oppress them even after they had paid by their blood to save the British Empire. So it is actually important to be able to appreciate that we are today, particularly because of the fundamental influence of the Second World War, particularly in nurturing the rise of militant African nationalism.
So when you talk about the African fighters were fighting for the oppressor, do you think or do you know if the African fighters really understood what was the whole point of the war, what they were fighting for?
You see, the Africans in a number of countries, whether you're talking about the countries dominated by France or Britain, like our case here, and the country of Nigeria, they were mere subjects of empire. They were not citizens. And as subjects of empire, their rights was not the responsibility of the ruler. They were just tools on the hands of the colonial state. I want to believe that many of them had least understanding of what the war was all about, okay, or why they were getting to it. There could have been short-term benefits, some small salary, some rations, and adventure outside the cocooned villages of the time. But beyond there, I don't think whether they understood the bigger picture of what was happening.
Christopher, let me bring you in here because many of the Africans may not have understood what exactly they were fighting for. So is Africa's commemoration of World War II driven by a shared sacrifice, historical injustice, or just lingering, colonial influence?
Well, I think there's a combination of all of that. And I think that to your question about whether Africans understood what they were fighting for, I think in many instances they did understand, in the sense that when you think about the anti-fascist movement of the 1930s, for instance, it's commonly framed as a European phenomenon, but in fact there was an African element to that. In 1935, the Mussolini regime in fascist Italy invaded Ethiopia at that time. And what happened after that was that many Africans in the diaspora, specifically in London, people like Jomo Kenyatta, George Dankwa in Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, who was based in the US, but he did a lot of traveling himself. They formed alliances with other Africans from the diaspora, people like CLR James of Trinidad and George Padmore, to form something called, for instance, the International African Service Bureau, which was an anti-fascist and anti-colonial movement. And the overall impact of that in terms of what happened on the African continent and in Ethiopia specifically, was mixed, but it raised awareness certainly amongst formally educated Africans, of which there were not that many in numerical terms, but it raised the specter really of the comparison between what was going on in Europe and what was happening on the African continent in terms of the colonial oppression by the European imperial powers.
So Christopher, let me bring you back to that war in Ethiopia of 1935, because World War II for Africa began much earlier than the European states. I mean, the first aggressive war, as you've mentioned, was unleashed by Mussolini. So why is Africa's involvement in this war so often left out of global narratives? It does seem to be quite muted.
Well, it relates to the old tale about how, when the victor tells a story, they tell it from their own perspective, right? And obviously, when you think of the distribution of power in the international system and, hegemonic power, as it were, that is the remit of Europe and North America, specifically the United States. So whenever the historiography of World War II and even World War I is told, it's often to frame and portray the Europeans and the Americans as the victors who did everything to save this world from destruction and all of that. The contributions of Africans, are always left out, and that's not by accident, because in fact, if you think of right then in the 30s and 40s, when the story of World War II was being told, where Africans were portrayed as volunteers in that war, it was often never told to European publics that far from being volunteers, many of these Africans were literally forced into conscription, even though the League of Nations outlawed conscription in colonial territories, but they were forced either directly by colonial forces or by chiefs who were imposed on African societies by colonial powers. So again, it's the age-old question about power, right? About how when a story is told from the perspective of the victor, they'll always come out looking good.
Right. So, Dr. Mbogi, why is it still important then for Africa to commemorate World War II 80 years on?
Thank you, Beatrice. Before I answer your question directly, let me weigh in what Christopher was saying about the dominant narratives. It's good that he's speaking from Nigeria. It is the legendary Chinua Achebe in one of his novels who said that until the lions will have their own historians, the story of the hunter will always glorify the hunter. That is basically what happens in telling the story of the Second World War. The Africans have not had a chance to tell their story. So the story that is being told is one that glorifies the so-called victors, the ones who, dominated the African continent, and their hegemonic influence has persisted even up to the time that we are speaking. Back to your question, why is it important to remember the Second World War?
For Africa. For
Africa. It's important mainly for us to be able to do what we call in historical discourse, to reinterpret the events of the period and make meaning of them, because we are what our past is ideally. The Second World War has had an impact that produced us as nations, as states of Africa today. If you look at, for example, when the war ends, there is a very strong ascendancy of nationalism that will lead to the descendancy of colonialism, directly related to the war. The African men, there were majority of them, they were men who went to the war. They saw how the British, the French, and the Belgians died just like them. And they realized that perhaps these guys were not as superior as they proclaimed, or as they had actually made them to believe.
Right. So, Christopher, weigh in on this. Just how profound do you think that the World War II had on Africa's political landscape moving forward and even today?
Here in West Africa, for instance, beginning in Nigeria, many of the veterans from that conflict, when they returned home, as I mentioned earlier, they weren't properly compensated. Some of them were actually captured by the Axis powers, and they were tortured, they were abused. In many instances, they were abused even by their own comrades, ostensible comrades anyway. So when they returned, as my colleague pointed out, the experiences they had in terms of the realization, or at least the bringing to life the fact that we're all human beings, as I mentioned, radicalized them. So in many instances here in Nigeria, many of the returnees came home more determined than ever to hasten the departure of colonial rule, and that's when, beginning in the mid to late 1940s, that's when anti-colonial movement tightened up. So things like the Nigeria Youth Movement, which started in the 1930s, accelerated demands for independence, and that's when constitutional reforms that eventually gave way to independence, that's when they gained more currency. And then in places like Ghana, which then was known as the Gold Coast, many more demands, even protests, people like Kwame Nkrumah, that's when their visibility as a statesman, really, because this was a person who was in many ways a statesman even before he was actually elected as prime minister and then president of what became Ghana. Same thing happened in what became Sierra Leone and Gambia. So there was a groundswell of movement toward a more militant form of demands for independence and autonomy from colonialism. It was never, of course, hunky-dory. In many instances, it got very violent, it got very bitter, it got very bloody, as in the case of Kenya, in East Africa, for instance. But that was the experiences of those mostly men, and their ability to spread the word about it kind of broke a dam that made the march towards decolonization irreversible.
Christopher, has the world learned anything from the Second World War? Because given the rising tensions among global powers, are we truly any closer to global peace today, or are we moving even closer to a repeat of global war logic?
It's important to always remember that in terms of in the big picture, the world is probably, certainly in terms of, deaths from conflict and things of that nature, the world is more peaceful today than it was, a century ago. Life expectancy rates are much higher, people live longer, there's much more economic prosperity in macro terms. But as my colleague correctly pointed out, when you look at broad trends in international relations, in trade, we live in a world now where tariff rates, for instance, are being jacked up to 60% in some countries. The collaboration and cooperation of the global multilateral system that was created in the wake of World War II is more or less history, as in terms of how we know of it today. The institutions that were created to keep the peace between the great powers, like the United Nations, for instance, have been gridlocked into ineffectiveness, particularly the UN Security Council, where the P5, as it were, hold all of the cards. And so everything we know about the lessons of World War II has been unlearned. And if anything, we're kind of living in Back to the Future, where all of the trends of the 1930s in terms of fascism, mercantilism, tariff rates, immigration restrictionism, all of these trends are right back with us. So time will tell, of course, whether we have truly absorbed the lessons and are willing to do anything about the fact that these trends are resurgent before it can get any nastier. But if history is any indication, if it's not nipped in the bud, it can end very badly for all of us.
Right. Dr. Mbogi, as a historian, I want to get your view on a lasting legacy of World War II. What would be your response?
Oh, well, I don't have to think very hard, Beatrice, to get that. It's just simply self-determination, particularly for the nations of Africa. When the World War II was happening, the whole of Africa was under the chains of colonialism by the Europeans. The Second World War provided the requisite fuel that fanned the wheels of nationalism and led to the emergence of the African independent, quote-unquote, independent states. Yes, for the last 60 years we have been limping. But as my namesake, the founding president of Zambia once said, we may be limping in Africa, but we are moving somehow. And that is the legacy of the Second World War.
Right, so gentlemen, I want to get to your closing remarks. And Christopher, let me start off with you, because you've talked about the need to strengthen multilateralism. So what mechanisms can be strengthened to ensure that as we commemorate the Second World War, it truly leads to peace-oriented policies?
So I'd like to point out the fact that when we talk about multilateralism, we often think about African countries as takers and passive recipients of global governance procedures. But in many ways, Africans were the original purveyors of what became multilateralism, in the sense that when the United Nations was formed, many of the core issues that animated the UN system at that time, such as the self-autonomy and move towards, let's say, for instance, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Many African anti-colonial leaders used that as a launching pad for their own demands for self-determination and independence and autonomy back home. And for the next couple of years of the UN's existence, African issues and African states, African nations, African peoples were crucial in terms of framing this move from the colonial era into what dovetailed with the Cold War in terms of the continued move towards autonomy and demands for a much more meaningful independence. You know, for instance, the international economic freedom order that was created in the United Nations by a set of global South states, including many African ones. They try to create a framework of true independence in the meaningful economic, political, and cultural sense from former imperial powers. These were all important elements of, for instance, the ANC in South Africa's fight against apartheid, and as well as in Southwest Africa, which became Namibia. These were all efforts by African states to deepen multilateralism. And after the Cold War, for instance, the creation of the International Criminal Court, African states were at the forefront of doing all of this, using, for instance, the experience in Rwanda with the genocide in 1994. So African states have created a blueprint for how to make multilateralism work. Right. The fact that they're able to do this means that African states can and should be converting some of this energy in the international forum into Africa's multilateral institutions like ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, the East African Community, the African Development Bank, and of course the African Union. So Africa has a template for international engagement. It should use it at home. Right.
So Dr. Mbogi, I want to get your final word. You have final thoughts here.
Yes. My brother from Nigeria has gone global. Allow me to go local. We say in my village that war has no eyes. Say gitelimaiso in my local dialect. That is really a lesson that we need to learn from the Second World War. Africans largely did not have, a panoramic picture of what was happening. But many of them lost lives, and the lasting impacts of that war affects people up to today. I lost some relatives who never returned home after they went to the war. Up to today, we don't know where they are, whether they are in Somaliland or in Burma. So that urges us as a world around us, whether through multilateralism or bilateral efforts, to make sure that we maintain some level of peace and stability around the world, for war has no eyes. It will actually involve those who were directly causing it and those who were indirectly not causing it, but nevertheless they will suffer.
All right, gentlemen, thank you both so very much for this lively discussion. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to my guests, Daniel Achini, East Africa Regional Manager for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, Christopher Ogunmodede, Policy Analyst and International Relations Expert, and Dr. Kenneth Mbogi, Associate Dean of Research and Postgraduate Studies at the University of Nairobi. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and X. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep the conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, it's goodbye.